Hey there, my name's Jerry Shannon. I'm a faculty member at University of Georgia. I direct something here called the Community Mapping Lab, and this is a short video about the ways that I at least think about expertise, or some of the issues that I think about expertise in community engaged research. So just some more background on me. So I run this community mapping lab here at UGA. We do a variety of projects around a range of issues, sometimes fairly straightforward, mapping some data an agency has. But in many cases, we're thinking about this politics around expertise in the sense that we're working with already existing communities of interest. One project I worked in recently was around housing displacement during urban renewal and former residents of a community whose claims had gone unlistened to, and thinking about what my addition to that project meant in terms of my perspective there, how the knowledge that I produce, maps or other kinds of statistical knowledge, relate to their experiences. We'll talk about that more in a second. Also do work with community housing assessments around the state of Georgia, and think about coming into a community and working with local stakeholders who are coming from a variety of perspectives to help facilitate them collecting data on housing conditions throughout their community, thinking about what kinds of recommendations I offer versus empowering them to think through what do these data mean from their own perspective, how does it change the way that they already think about their communities as well. So it's just to give some background on where I'm coming from with these. One of the pieces I want to draw from here is this piece by Jason Coburn called Street Science, came out, I believe, in 2005. And in the second chapter of that book, he draws a distinction between what he terms local and professional knowledge. I think that's useful. We've certainly seen plenty of other work out there thinking about, particularly around indigenous knowledge, that I think is relevant to this as well. But in this case, what he's thinking about is how members of the community articulate particularly environmental risks and environmental issues locally, environmental justice kinds of things, versus the ways that professionals do. And that local knowledge is often seen as somewhat less credible because it's often more narrative. It kind of has mixed epistemologies that don't always hold together if you think about it really systematically, academically, versus professional knowledge that's much more experimental, but much more cut off from the daily realities of people in the community and the kinds of lived expertise that those folks might have. And I really think the key term here, right, is credibility. When we're thinking about expertise, we're thinking about what makes knowledge credible. And some of that's the qualifications that the person who's expressing this knowledge makes, but also the epistemological stance of that knowledge, narrative versus statistical studies versus qualitative research, right? Those all have different kinds of connotations. And so that question of what makes evidence credible is really important. And one of the things his book does is kind of think through how do we blend those two together? How do we develop an approach that leverages both of those kinds of expertise? I also think it's important to think about the conditions in which expertise matters. So let me get rid of myself here. These are a couple of quotes from pieces that have been helpful for me in thinking through this. So John Forrester is a pragmatist planner. He advocates something called critical pragmatism, and he describes it this way. So how might we distinguish between a more ordinary pragmatism and a more critical pragmatism? The critical pragmatist, we might say initially, will attend not only to the consequences of framing a problem in a certain way, that is, pragmatism is really concerned with why are we asking the question we're asking, problem formation, and then social inquiry, but to the contingencies of the relations of power and authority that can make alternative frames and knowledge claims more or less plausible in the first place. That is, we're thinking about the conditions in which expertise is established themselves. And I think this is a really core tension in community geography work, that often we think about the kinds of expertise, I'm going to say we as academics tend to think about the kinds of expertise that we can provide that moves the project forward, while also recognizing how incredibly problematic the kinds of authority that we are invested in is, and the ways that it undercuts more local or indigenous forms of knowing. The second quote here is Kate Derrickson and Paul Rutledge, their piece in Professional Geographer, and thinking about how we understand the challenges that non-academic collaborators face in affecting the change they want to see, and how social relations might be transformed in ways that create the conditions for success. And in particular, I thought quite a bit about, with expertise, the ways that often folks with kind of official, institutional, professional knowledge are brought in to resource-poor communities. And that often the expectation of those community members is that those academics, those professionals, can be useful to them. Right? That kind of knowledge is extremely useful because they don't have the ability to draw from kind of the kinds of methodological expertise, substantive knowledge that's useful for advancing the claims they want to make. And I think while we can recognize that that ground is problematic, we also have to recognize that in the short term, communities very much find that often in their interest to try to play that game Strategic positivism is another way that's been framed. So some closing quick questions as we're running out of time here. When you're thinking about how expertise works in a project, what forms of expertise are valued in a project? How are they useful? What are the structural politics around local and indigenous knowledge and the ways it's valued and not valued? How do academics amplify rather than undermine the authority of community partners? That is, when we have results, how do we say this just confirms what they were already saying, rather than saying our results somehow are a stamp of approval that was lacking before, right? And then how do we balance current usefulness of academic expertise against the need to value alternative epistemologies? So expertise is tricky, it's complicated, but it's a really important part of thinking through how we do community-engaged research.